The journalist who had received the mysterious message hesitated before going public with it. The list of names suggested something deeper, something far beyond the walls of the university. But without solid proof, exposing it could put lives at risk. The journalist chose caution, continuing the investigation behind the scenes, knowing that the truth had to come out carefully, piece by piece. For the students who had fought so hard, there was a mix of relief and exhaustion. Some felt hopeful that their voices had finally been heard. Others remained skeptical, wondering if real change would last or if it was just another temporary fix. The student's family, still grieving, found some comfort in knowing their child's story had sparked a national movement. But no amount of reform could bring them back, and that reality weighed heavy on everyone's hearts. The Prime Minister, having stepped in at the peak of the crisis, moved on to other matters of governance, but his reputation had been tested. The government's response, though late, had kept the situation from spiraling further. Yet, there was an unspoken understanding: this issue wasn't over. The systems that had failed students for so long wouldn't be fixed overnight. As the country moved forward, small but meaningful changes began to take shape. Universities across Nepal started implementing counseling services, reviewing academic pressures, and opening discussions on student welfare. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Conversations that had once been silenced were now happening in the open. In the end, the protesters had done what they set out to do. They had forced those in power to listen. The students' story would not be forgotten, and while the full truth remained just out of reach, one thing was certain: this was not the last time young voices would rise against injustice. They had shown the country and the world that they would not be ignored. A quiet campus turned into a battleground overnight. What started as a peaceful vigil in memory of a young student quickly spiraled into a wave of protests, anger, and demands for justice. Streets filled with students, their voices echoing through the air, carrying a mix of grief and outrage. They were not just mourning the loss of one of their own, they were demanding answers. Why did this tragedy happen? Who is responsible? And most importantly, could it have been prevented? This heartbreaking story comes from Nepal, where a student's suicide has shaken an entire nation. The pain of losing a young life is always unbearable, but when circumstances hint at deeper issues, systemic failures, academic pressures, or institutional negligence, it sparks something bigger. The anger seen on the streets is not just about this one incident, it's about a pattern, a feeling that students are unheard, unseen, and pushed to the edge. As tensions escalated, the protests caught the attention of Nepal's Prime Minister himself. A rare move. When the country's leader steps in, it means something is terribly wrong. But will his intervention bring justice, or is it just an attempt to calm the storm? What really happened to the student? And what does this unrest say about the larger issues facing Nepal's youth today? The answers aren't simple, and the emotions are raw. Stay with us as we uncover the full story: what led to this moment, how the government is reacting, and what comes next. The student at the center of this tragedy was young, ambitious, and full of dreams, just like thousands of others who walk the corridors of Nepal's universities every day. Friends remember them as hardworking, always striving for excellence, but also someone who carried invisible burdens. The pressure to succeed, the weight of expectations, and the fear of failure can be crushing in a system where competition is fierce and support is often lacking. But was this just another case of academic stress, or was there something more? Rumors began to spread almost immediately. Some whispered about harassment, others pointed to institutional negligence, and many believed the system itself was to blame. Was there a warning sign that was ignored? Did someone fail to step in when it mattered the most? The silence from authorities only fueled the fire, making students feel abandoned, unheard, and pushed to take matters into their own hands. Then came the protests. What began as small gatherings of grieving classmates quickly turned into mass demonstrations. Students from different universities joined in, their frustration boiling over into the streets. The message was clear: this was not just about one life lost, It was about a system that felt broken. They demanded accountability, better mental health support, and a change in the way students were treated. But as their voices grew louder, so did the pushback. Security forces were deployed, roads were blocked. Officials urged calm, but their words did little to ease the tension. The government's slow response only deepened the divide. Some saw it as an attempt to control the narrative, while others believed it was a sign that authorities had no real answers. That's when Nepal's Prime Minister finally stepped in. His involvement raised more questions than answers. Was this a genuine effort to address the crisis, or just a move to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control? Would there be real change, or would this be another moment that fades away with time? The people weren't convinced, and the protests continued. As the situation unfolds, one thing is clear: this is more than a single tragic incident. It is a reflection of a much larger issue, one that speaks to the fears, struggles, and voices of an entire generation. What happens next will determine whether this becomes a turning point or just another painful chapter in Nepal's history. As the protests grew, so did the divide between the students and the authorities. What started as a demand for justice soon turned into a larger conversation, one about mental health, academic pressure, and the power imbalance between students and institutions. The university remained largely silent, issuing only a brief statement expressing condolences, but offering little explanation. This silence only added to the frustration. If they had nothing to hide, why weren't they addressing the students' concerns? Among the protesters were the students' close friends, those who had seen the warning signs, those who had heard their struggles but felt powerless to help. They spoke of sleepless nights, impossible deadlines, and a growing sense of isolation. One of them, a roommate, recalled how their friend had reached out to faculty for support but was met with indifference. It wasn't just about one student anymore. It was about a pattern, one where young lives were crumbling under pressure, and no one seemed to care until it was too late. But it never reached the right hands. The journalist hinted that someone, whether within the university or beyond, had intentionally suppressed it. The protests, already at a boiling point, erupted further. Chants of "We want justice" turned into demands for resignations, for immediate arrests. The students' case was no longer just a tragic loss. It was now surrounded by secrecy, unanswered questions, and a system that seemed more interested in protecting itself than in seeking the truth. Amidst the chaos, tensions spread within the government itself. Some officials supported the students, calling for urgent reforms, while others warned that the protests needed to be controlled before they spiraled into something bigger. The divide was growing, and behind closed doors, a battle was playing out, one that could decide the future of the entire movement. Then, something happened that no one saw coming. Late one night, a key university official, one of the few people who might have had answers, was suddenly unreachable. Calls went unanswered, their office was locked, and no one seemed to know where they had gone. Some whispered that they had fled, fearing exposure. Others suspected something worse. This disappearance threw everything into chaos. If this person truly had the missing piece of the puzzle, what did they know? And more importantly, who didn't want them to speak? The protesters refused to back down. If anything, the stakes had just been raised. This was no longer just about student rights, no longer just about one tragic loss. This was about uncovering a truth that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. And now, as the country held its breath, everyone was left asking the same question: how far would those in power go to keep it hidden? The disappearance of the university official sent shockwaves through the movement. The protests, which had already reached an intense peak, now carried an urgent new demand. Where was the missing official, and what did they know? Speculation ran wild. Had they gone into hiding out of fear, or had someone made sure they wouldn't be able to talk? Then, in a sudden turn of events, the official was found. Not in another country, not in a safe house, but in a hospital under heavy security. Government sources claimed it was a health emergency, but few believed that. The timing was too suspicious. Whispers of pressure, threats, and forced silence filled the air, and then came the moment that changed everything. A leaked document surfaced, an internal report from the university administration, marked confidential. It contained complaints from multiple students, all reporting the same issue. The student who had died wasn't the only one who had tried to speak up. Others had come forward before, raising concerns about mistreatment, about being pushed to their limits, about a toxic culture that had been ignored for too long. The protests, once fueled by grief and frustration, now had undeniable proof. This wasn't just about one tragic death. It was about a system that had ignored warning signs again and again, only taking notice when it was too late. With the truth out in the open, the pressure on the government and the university reached an unbearable level. Finally, the Prime Minister made a decisive move. Several high-ranking officials, including senior members of the university administration, were suspended pending investigation. A special task force was set up to implement student welfare reforms, and policies on academic pressure and mental health support were promised. For the first time, it felt like real change might be coming. But just when it seemed like justice was within reach, an unexpected twist shattered the moment. The journalist who had exposed the cover-up received an anonymous message, one chilling line: "This is bigger than you think." Along with it, an attachment, a list of names, people connected to the case, but from outside the university. Politicians, business figures, people with influence. The victory, though significant, suddenly felt incomplete. The students had won a battle, but was there a larger war still hidden beneath the surface? As the protests slowed and the country tried to move forward, one thing became clear: the fight for the truth was far from over. As the dust settled, the protests slowly began to fade. The streets that had been filled with thousands of voices demanding justice grew quieter, but the impact of what had happened remained. The university was forced to acknowledge its failures, pledging reforms and mental health programs for students. Officials who had long ignored these issues were now under scrutiny, and some had already stepped down. For many, this felt like a victory, but for others, it was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's intervention added another layer of complexity. He called for an investigation, urging authorities to take the matter seriously. But was this enough? Many students remained skeptical, believing that the real issue wasn't just about one investigation. It was about changing a system that had failed them for years. Some student leaders were invited for talks with government officials, but they left the meetings feeling unheard. Promises were made, but no real action was taken. Then came another twist. Reports began surfacing that some student activists were receiving threats, subtle warnings to step back, to let things go. Some even claimed they were being followed. Was someone trying to suppress the movement? The students refused to be intimidated, but the fear was real. If they kept pushing, would they face consequences? At the same time, parents began to speak out. Some shared their own stories, how their children had struggled under similar pressures, how they had seen their kids break down, but felt helpless to change anything. Others demanded reforms, calling on universities to provide better mental health resources. Their voices added strength to the movement, but also deepened the urgency. If change didn't happen now, how many more students would suffer? The protests showed no signs of slowing down. More cities saw demonstrations, more people joined in. The tension in the air was thick, something had to give. But the question remained: would the government listen, or would this struggle only lead to more pain? The streets were no longer just filled with students. Activists, teachers, and even parents had joined the movement. What had started as a single protest had now become a nationwide call for change. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time, those in power seemed to realize that this was not something they could ignore. But instead of bringing solutions, their response only deepened the divide. Authorities began cracking down. Reports of students being detained started circulating. Some protesters claimed that plainclothes officers were moving through the crowds, identifying those leading the chants. The fear that had been simmering in the background now became real. Was the movement at risk of being silenced? Despite this, the students refused to back down. Each arrest only fueled their determination. Their voices grew louder, their demands more urgent. Inside the university, tensions were just as high. Faculty members were being questioned. Some openly supported the students, while others remained silent, afraid of losing their positions. Documents began surfacing, hinting at possible negligence by the administration. Leaked messages suggested that concerns about student well-being had been raised before, but were dismissed. The university was on the defensive now, scrambling to control the damage, but every new revelation only made things worse. Meanwhile, the government's promises of an investigation seemed to be moving too slowly. Students demanded immediate action, but officials urged patience. These things take time, they said, but time was exactly what the protesters didn't have. Every passing day felt like another attempt to push the tragedy into the background, another effort to let the anger fade. Then, a shocking development changed everything. A key witness, someone who had spoken to the student just days before their death, came forward with new information. What they revealed sent shockwaves through the protesters, the media, and the nation. It wasn't just about stress or pressure. There was something deeper, something that had been hidden all along. Rumors spread like wildfire. People demanded answers. The energy in the protests shifted from grief to outrage. This wasn't just about one student anymore. This was about justice, about uncovering the truth that had been buried. And then, in the middle of it all, an unexpected announcement came from the Prime Minister's office. It was sudden, urgent, and it changed the course of the entire movement. But would it be enough? Or was this just the beginning of an even bigger fight? The announcement from the Prime Minister's office sent ripples through the nation. It was unexpected, brief, and raised more questions than answers. Officials promised a special inquiry, a high-level investigation that would leave no stone unturned. But instead of calming the protests, it did the opposite. If the government was taking such drastic steps now, what had they been hiding before? Why did it take this level of pressure for action to begin? As students waited for real answers, another shocking revelation surfaced, this time from an independent journalist who had been quietly investigating behind the scenes. They claimed to have uncovered evidence suggesting that the student had tried to report something before their death. A formal complaint had allegedly been made,